All new Pacific Mornings with Will on 531 PI.
All right, it's 6:34. You're listening to Pacific Mornings on 531 PI. Now, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump squared off on Friday in the first presidential debate of the 2024 election cycle. Now, voters across the country have expressed concern about the candidates' ages. Biden is 81 and Trump is 78, and the debate has supercharged that anxiety. Still, with weeks left until the conventions when each party will formalise their choice of candidates, supporters of both major parties feel they are left with few options. Here for his reaction to the debate is Jeffrey Miller, international relations expert. Very good morning to you.
Good morning, William.
Jeepers, let's talk about the debate, the first debate. We had a lying Trump and we had a sleepy Joe. It was a disastrous debate, wasn't it?
It was. Disaster is really the only word that sums up that debate. I watched the full 90 minutes on Friday afternoon here in New Zealand, and you didn't have high expectations for Joe Biden, it must be said, coming in to watch that debate. But he performed even worse than those low expectations. He couldn't complete answers. Some of his answers were just illogical. He looked terrible on screen. He stood there almost motionless with his mouth open a lot of the time while Trump was speaking. He looked lifeless. He looked insipid. He looked wooden. It was a terrible performance. And there was a poll conducted just after the debate, a snap poll that showed two-thirds of those who had watched the debate thought that Trump had won. It was a huge defeat for Joe Biden in that debate. And usually these TV debates are not like that. Usually they're pretty much a draw, and essentially voters, choose whichever candidate they like best. So if you're a Trump supporter, you think Trump won. If you're a Biden supporter, you think Biden won. But that wasn't the case on Friday or Thursday night in the US. It really was a clear defeat for Joe Biden. It was just woeful. And then after the debate, you had all manner of pundits and supporters even of Joe Biden, the New York Times editorial board, Thomas Friedman, Paul Krugman, these sort of top names from the pundit class, if you like, all started saying Joe Biden should step down. He's just not up to the job. And that's perhaps been as harmful as the debate itself.
Here's what I find so baffling, though. We had both the Biden camp and the Trump camp, perhaps even more so the Biden camp, really pushing for this early debate. Obviously, this is a very early debate. The election is some time away. How do you think, or here's perhaps the million-dollar question, what do you think went wrong? Surely the preparation went into this from Joe Biden and his team, and it's clear he fell short of it.
Indeed, I think the Biden camp has been living in a bubble to some degree, and they haven't wanted to face up to reality. I mean, it's not a secret about Joe Biden's gaffes and his weakness. This has been talked about for months, particularly on the right, who of course have taken advantage of Joe Biden's weakness, and they've pointed out any gaffes that he's made, and these videos have gone viral on the internet. But the White House has continually said, oh, this is misinformation. Joe Biden's up to the job. He's fine. And to be fair, Joe Biden, when he's on his game, he looks good. But there was a report out over the weekend that said that Joe Biden only does well when it's between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And outside those hours, it's pretty much a gamble whether he's going to be up to whatever you're asking him to do. So, the Biden camp have sheltered Biden very well, but this was in a situation in which they had no control. Joe Biden was out there on the debate stage. He was allowed no notes, no advisors on stage, and it showed. He just was not up to the job, and American voters saw that, perhaps for the first time, many of them so openly on that debate stage.
Mm. And now, apparently, following the debate, the Democrats are in a spiral here, questioning whether Biden is the man for the job, and a lot of coverage over the past few days, particularly in the US, over the future of Biden and whether he is fit to run for president. Asking you, do you think it is appropriate, or should he step down?
Well, look, again, if you look at the polls, 72% of American voters think that Joe Biden is not up to the job, or that there should be another candidate selected. But yet that's probably not going to happen simply because it's too late. There was a primary process in the United States. Each party still goes through a primary process, even if their candidate is the one who's the incumbent. and Joe Biden won virtually every delegate there back in the US winter. So uh, there's a convention in 6 weeks' time. 6 weeks' time. I mean, in theory, it's possible to replace Joe Biden at that convention. In practice, it's almost impossible unless Joe Biden himself decides to stand down. But there's really no great sign of that. He held a rally on Friday and said that, he's going to continue. He said that, he can have a bad debate day, but he knows how to tell the truth. So I don't think there's any great chance of Joe Biden throwing in the towel. It's just too late. Things have gone too far, and having a sudden last minute change of candidate would present its own problems. I mean, it would look chaotic in itself, especially when there's no obvious uh, replacement for Joe Biden lying in waiting, because Kamala Harris, the vice presidential or the vice president, who would be the logical choice perhaps to take over from Joe Biden, she has her own problems. I mean, she's not any more popular than Joe Biden, really. She's also known for being gaffe prone. It's unlikely that she would be that convincing to voters in the swing states. She's from California. Typically in the United States, you need to have someone from one of the what we call the swing states, the states that could go either way, the likes of Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, Wisconsin, these kinds of states. But she's from California. And some of the other options are similar. Gavin Newsom, the
Mm.
governor of California, is talked about. But yes, he's from California, which is a solidly blue Democratic state these days. It's not like in Reagan's time where it would be possible, I think, for a candidate from California to do well. I think it's very, very unlikely against Trump. But, who knows? We've seen a lot of unprecedented things happen over the past few years, of course, with COVID and everything else, and you never know. It's at some point maybe Joe Biden just sees the writing on the wall and faces up to reality and says I'm off, and then the party will have to find someone else to do the
Mm.
job and face up to Donald Trump on November the 5th.
Do you think, and this is probably me being cheeky here or facetious, but could the US, or the Democrats rather, could they have an Ardern moment? You know, how if we cast our minds back to the 2017 election here in New Zealand, where Ardern was pushed into the role, and then within a matter of weeks, Labour's polling was incredible. And look, she took them to new heights. Could we see something like that in the US, or is it just very different?
I think it is unlikely. I think it is a very different system. It's very bureaucratic. The whole process of choosing a nominee, a presidential nominee, is quite different to the process of changing a party leader in the New Zealand system. Uh, and unlike in 2017 in New Zealand, where Jacinda Ardern was there waiting as an obvious replacement, you don't actually have an obvious replacement in the United States at the moment. There's no clear person who would do better. If you did have, a Barack Obama-like figure, perhaps waiting in the wings, you could say, well, it's obvious we would do much better. All the polls show that this person would do much better than Joe Biden. Let's choose that person. Let's get Joe to stand down, and then we can put person X into the top job. There just isn't someone like that.
Mm.
And that's probably Joe Biden's best card to play, to say, well, there is no one else, and I can do better. Uh, I mean, the perhaps the strongest argument that Joe Biden's team have put out is that, look, this was just one debate. You can have a bad debate night, but he's had a great presidency. And when you look at the economic indicators in the United States at the moment, things are looking pretty good for Joe Biden. Economic growth is doing well. Inflation is down to under 4%. I mean, it's lower than in New Zealand. Voters still don't feel those gains because wage growth has been very sluggish over the last few years with the high inflation. But things are looking up. Stock markets are at record highs in the United States. So in theory, the Democratic candidate should have an easy ride to the presidency. It's not the case in Joe Biden's situation because of his age and because
Mm.
he's just personally such a weak performer. But, as I said, all the other options are not great either. So he's got a few months. It's the 1st of July today. He's got 4 months until the 5th of November, until election day. And probably by the time you get to November, this debate in the end of June will probably not be forgotten, but it will have receded in a lot of voters' memories, and that's perhaps what the Biden camp are counting on. But they've got another debate to get through in September, so there's one more hurdle to clear. But apart from that, Joe Biden can be protected. He can be stage managed, and at the rallies that he speaks, for example, the one on Friday where he looked much more confident, he's allowed to use an auto cue, a teleprompter with all his notes. So he looks much more confident because he's got some props there. So
Yes.
if the Democrats can get him through one debate, then perhaps they'll get him through.
Before we move on, I just want to draw it back into the context of the Pacific and why this matters to the Pacific. Now, we've seen in recent years, particularly under the Biden administration, a reinforced effort to have a US presence in the Pacific Islands. We've seen Biden promise mega cash for Pacific Island nations. Much of which is still yet to come. But if we cast our minds to the future for a sec, and it looks like it's a Trump presidency, what could that mean for the Pacific in your view? Do you feel like Trump would perhaps reinforce, move away from the Pacific? What do you think a Trump presidency would look like for the Pacific?
That's a really good question, and it's one I've thought about. I think if you look at Donald Trump, while he is famous for his America First doctrine, I think he's also very anti-China, and that's been was a big theme of his presidency last time. When Joe Biden came into office, he actually continued most of Donald Trump's policies towards China in terms of foreign policy. He continued a hardline stance towards China when it comes to things like tariffs, for example, and just the continued escalation of tensions with China in terms of the overall geopolitical situation. So there was a lot of continuity, and I think that's what you're probably likely to see if Donald Trump did win the White House again. I think he would continue in large part, with the policies, not because he cares about the Pacific. I don't think Donald Trump does, but he does care about this wider competition with China. And he would probably see the Pacific as, ideal pawns in this game. And so I think he would, in all likelihood, probably the current policy settings towards the Pacific would continue. That includes, more visits, greater attention on the Pacific, and more money, fundamentally. I think that would probably continue, despite, all the rhetoric about, America first, and, we need to look after our own citizens, etc. I think Donald Trump would probably largely continue with the foreign policy settings in the Pacific. I think he would continue the settings we're seeing at the moment under Joe Biden.
Now let's turn our attention from the US to France. Obviously this morning developments continue to unfold there following the first round of elections. It looks as though France's far right has made big gains in that first round, and voter turnout as well in the French parliamentary election was, quote, the highest in 40 years. It looks like the National Rally's Marine Le Pen, she's just given a speech moments ago saying she's pretty much practically wiped out Macron's camp, who is of course the current president. What do you make of the situation there at the moment?
It is really interesting. As you say, turnout is much, much higher, so it suggests a level of voter enthusiasm as well. But you've got the National Rally, as it's called, which is Marine Le Pen's party, winning 34% of the vote in these legislative elections. It's the highest share. Macron's party is actually in third place with just 20% of the vote. I think we need to be clear here. These are legislative elections, so these are not presidential elections. They were held last year. So they're not, in a sense, an election that's going to change the French president, but they are quite a powerful signal that voters are frustrated. And I think that's probably the word that sums up voters both in the United States and in France and probably in New Zealand and to a large degree. It's these same frustrations. Cost of living is a huge issue, and this has spilled over then into anti-immigration sentiment in France particularly. I mean, in Europe as a whole. We saw the European elections last month as well, and voters were very frustrated there and voted in large numbers for these anti-immigration parties. I think when you look at figures like Macron or Joe Biden, it just shows that they need to deliver for ordinary people at the
Mm,
end of the day. They have to make these economic gains distributed better. They have to see that voters at the bottom or in the working classes, in the middle classes,
mm,
feel this economic prosperity that they're supposedly achieving. We're seeing inflation come off. We're seeing economic growth increase in the United States at least, and elsewhere. As I said earlier, the stock markets are at record highs, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. And yet, many people just feel that they're being left behind and
mm.
they're not achieving the gains. The wage growth is sluggish, inflation is really high. You see these high prices at the supermarkets. That's in New Zealand. Of course, everyone has felt high inflation over the last several years, and it's the case in most of the Western world. So, I think it's a real lesson here for incumbents that you've got to deliver. And it's just not enough to say, look, economic growth is going up, inflation has really come down, things are getting better. You've actually got to see that voters feel these gains in their back pockets. And it's a
Certainly.
real, real challenge for democracies all around the world at the moment.
And just, it is good of you to point out in terms of the difference here with this election. But do you anticipate just based on these results, anything happening or changing with the situation in New Caledonia?
Not in the short term. That amendment to the French Constitution,
Mm,
that whole process was suspended by Emmanuel Macron a few weeks ago,
hmm.
and I think there will be a rethink of that. Of course, it is true that these new legislative election results could potentially change the dynamics of that process. Marine Le Pen, she's been very clear that New Caledonia is part of France, and a right-leaning leader or far-right leader as she is, and her party is just going to have less truck perhaps with any protest. They're going to take a harder line position, but they have to work with Emmanuel Macron, the president, on this. The president has a good deal of sway over these kinds of issues, foreign policy issues. So
Yes.
look, in the medium term, perhaps that amendment gets put back on the table, the amendment to give French nationals who've moved to New Caledonia and lived there for at least a decade, gives them the right to vote. That will come perhaps back on the agenda. When it does, maybe we will see a rekindling of that unrest. But you hope that, there are some ongoing negotiations and talks to uh, try and resolve this situation in New Caledonia that we saw those riots break out over
Mm,
earlier in the year, because it was, yeah, it was really sad to see, and there just has to be a political solution to that problem
certainly.
found, and it's not going to benefit Marine Le Pen having riots and unrest in New Caledonia either. So
Yes.
I think there probably will be some desire to bring about some kind of solution or compromise there.
Mm. And finally, just very quickly before we head into the ad break, I just want to ask your opinion. Obviously, we've got the UK general election this week as well. Polls have for long suggested that this is Labour's pretty much to win, and it's a clean sweep for Labour. What's your prediction there?
Yes, this is on Thursday, and it looks like it's going to be a big victory for Labour. The only question is by how much. The cat amongst the pigeons is really Nigel Farage's Reform Party, and in the UK they still have first past the post voting. So Reform, which is a right-wing party, far-right party essentially, they could split the vote with the Tories and make Labour's win even bigger. There's not a lot of enthusiasm. I mean, there's some enthusiasm for Labour, but there's not a great wave of support as there was for Tony Blair in 1997. It's much more of we've had enough of the Tories under Rishi Sunak than we really, really want Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, as Prime Minister. But that's probably what's going to happen. So watch out for those results on Friday morning New Zealand time.
Definitely, I'll be getting the popcorn out to watch that. That is international relations expert Jeffrey Miller. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, William.